Hi, in this video I will talk about working memory and attention. I will start by giving a quick overview of how information flows through working memory. Then I'll talk about how attention plays a role in working memory. And lastly, I'll go over a model for working memory and a few findings that question how information is really stored in working memory and how attention is involved. So what is working memory? Well, not exactly this kind of working memory. More like this kind. Oberauer describes working memory as the mechanisms and processes that hold mental representations currently most needed for ongoing cognitive tasks available for processing. In other words, it's how we hold information that we currently need for thinking. The extent to where we can call an item in memory working memory is pretty broad, however. Some people describe it as including just the things that we attend to. Others say that it overlaps with long-term memory, where items that we don't directly attend to but are in working memory get stored as part of the long-term memory system. However, evidence also suggests that even items that we currently attend to can already get stored in the long-term memory system within a fast period of time that is often associated with working memory. This makes the exact distinction between working memory and long-term memory a difficult one to identify in practice. It seems like there is no good concrete definition at this point. Since we do not know exactly how it works, it's difficult to say what the processes and mechanisms of working memory are exactly. So while the interpretations for working memory can vary, once we have more knowledge about how it works, we will be able to define it more concretely. What about attention? We know what it feels like to pay attention to some item. We can get distracted, shift our attention to something else, and then come back to the item that we were previously attending to. Oberauer provides two ways of thinking about it. One as the limited resource for information processing, and another one as a process or mechanism for the selection of information to be processed with priority. Personally, I think that the focus of attention is a more important and concrete way of understanding how attention interacts with working memory. The focus of attention is when an item in memory appears to be in a privileged state. There are many descriptions to what this could mean, whether it's an active versus a silent state of neuron activity, whether it's the activation of different regions of the brain, or if it's a different representation in the way that neurons are activated. Attending to items helps us process them, enables us to detect them better from their stimuli, and improves their storage in long-term memory. This allows us to differentiate attended memory items from unattended memory items, which are in a prioritized state of working memory compared to the unattended memory items. One way of looking at it is by viewing working memory as a prioritized portion of long-term memory, with the focus of attention highlighting a chunk of working memory, and where the central executive process is responsible for bringing items into and out of attention. This is a good representation of working memory since information can easily be exchanged between working memory and long-term memory, where working memory can hold a subset of long-term memory. It also highlights the role of focus of attention well. However, there are some important differences between working memory and long-term memory that make them two distinct things, something that this model fails to suggest, like how long information can be stored and the amount of information that can be stored within the two systems. Also, this model does not suggest anything about how and what information flows between the two systems. Next, we will take a look at a different model for how information flows between them. The multi-store model was important in showing how information flows through the memory system. Information comes from the outside world and enters into sensory memory. Next, attended items travel into short-term memory. From short-term memory, items can be encoded into long-term memory to be retrieved later. This model provides a good general overview of how information flows through the system, and points out that information can be lost at each stage of the process, an important observation in this model. That is, not all information is moved from sensory memory to short-term memory. Some of it gets lost. This means that for many items, short-term memory has a more crude representation than sensory memory, and long-term memory has a more crude representation than short-term memory, leading to different specializations in holding and processing information. In a later model, short-term memory was replaced with working memory, with the major distinction being that working memory is not a single store of information, rather a more complex model for processing information. Yet the two have similar general qualities. While they are often used interchangeably, working memory is more concrete and is more commonly used today. In this model by Baddeley and Hitch, working memory is broken down into the central executive, visuospatial sketchpad, and the phonological loop. It has been noted that these systems can store and process information separately, without significantly interfering with each other. Yet processes in the same domain cause interference. That is, if we try to talk and draw a simple shape at the same time, we will find the task relatively easy. Yet if we try to talk and rehearse a song in our heads at the same time, we find it nearly impossible, since both of these systems use the phonological loop. The episodic buffer can also be included in this model for working memory, holding episodic memories. While these are important components of working memory, I will not go into further detail, since my focus will be more on the interaction between working memory and attention. So for the model I will use, this will all be part of working memory. Also, in this model I only labeled how information flows to or from working memory. For perceiving information, there is top-down regulation of what enters working memory from sensory memory, which is represented by the dotted arrow from working memory to the sensory memory. I did the same with retrieval of long-term memory. It is selected for, so in selecting information from long-term memory, working memory has to indicate what information it is looking for. Lastly, I kept the maintenance loop in working memory, since it is still a topic of discussion. So how does attention play a role in working memory? Let's start by looking at what we know about the retention and loss of information in working memory. While early on it was postulated that working memory can hold 7 plus or minus 2 items, recent studies have believed that working memory can store around 3 or 4 units of memory. Cohen suggests that previously, memory from other memory stores were counted as working memory, accounting for the larger calculated working memory capacity. What about attention? Some believe that only one item can be held in the focus of attention. However, more recent evidence suggests that it is a more complicated matter that could allow attending to different types of memory at the same time, like memory in the phonological loop, episodic buffer, and visuospatial sketchpad from Baddeley's model. One question raised about working memory is whether information needs to be refreshed. Some models view attention as helping refresh working memory directly. However, another model proposes that when attention is used for processing information, it automatically refreshes working memory. Under this view, working memory would not need to be refreshed. There has been experimental evidence of sustained activity in working memory, which in a sense is a way of refreshing itself without a direct refreshing loop. This seems like the most plausible way of maintaining working memory. It seems likely that if there is a mechanism for maintaining memory, then the items that are not maintained are lost. It was observed that after an item is lost from working memory, when similar information appears, the old memory interferes with representations of similar items. One possible explanation for this is that information is not fully removed from working memory when it is lost. That is, some remembered aspects remain and can interfere with a different memory, or complete a similar memory. However, it is unclear if this information is stored in working memory or long-term memory. Another proposal about the role of attention is that it can control what enters and exits working memory. That is, it can choose what information it can take in and filter out. While attention has been shown to play an important role in top-down processing, there hasn't been much evidence to support its role in removing information from working memory. Attention seems to play an important role in prioritizing information. We know that if a list of items is told to us, it is easier to remember the last few items, indicating some sort of prioritization. A few explanations to this include the interference of more recently encoded items or the decay of earlier items. Both of these make remembering earlier information harder, hence prioritizing recent information. Yet, this might be a more complicated issue, since long-term memory might also play a role in influencing how we remember this information, hence prioritizing some of it. This brings us to the issue of what long-term memory really is, and the extent to which it is defined. The main difference between long-term and working memory is that long-term can hold an almost limitless amount of information for a long time. However, it has a plastic border with working memory, whereas some describe working memory in two groups, focus of attention and activated long-term memory, and others suggest that working memory and long-term memory are separate entities and can share information with each other. Same as with defining working memory, we will be able to more concretely define long-term memory and its interactions with other systems as we know more about it, whether it is defined as a separate entity from working memory or if working memory is just a subset of long-term. Cohen proposes that working memory relies on long-term memory for chunking of information for better recall. That is, a group of items can be associated together and stored in long-term memory. Then, only one item from that group would need to be remembered in working memory to have access to all of them. Other uses of long-term information include filling in information that we are missing. That is, if we need some information for a goal, if it is stored in long-term memory, then long-term memory can provide that information. This has been observed through proactive facilitation, where long-term memory can facilitate information held in working memory, filling in missing information. However, proactive interference has not been observed, meaning that unrelated information does not interfere with information in working memory. This suggests that working memory either somehow activates specific information from long-term memory, or it is able to filter out information that long-term memory provides based on its relevance. So how does attention play a role in this? Processing information involves exchanging information between working memory and long-term memory. It has been observed that processing information, remembering information, both of which are facilitated by attention, are competitive tasks. So when people have to remember information while completing a mental task, they perform the task more poorly. One hypothesis explaining this is that attention in working memory is shared between processing information and storing it. However, it has been found that the cost of memory retention is reduced if there is a gap between the onset of a processing task and the encoding of information. That is, if participants were asked to remember something, and then after a few seconds they were asked to complete a mental processing task, the retained memory showed almost no interference with the processing task. This, however, might be a sign that memory had been encoded into long-term memory, meaning attention in working memory is no longer needed to facilitate its storage. This working memory and processing capacity correlates with intelligence and aptitude measures, the ability to resist distracting stimuli, and interestingly, mind wandering. One proposed explanation for mind wandering is that under lower demand tasks, people are able to split their attention amongst multiple items, begging the question of how attention is distributed amongst processing tasks and what controls it. This brings us to the next question: how attention plays a role with sensory input. Sensory information brings in detailed information about the environment. One perspective views attention as an important process to determine which information is important and which isn't. In this view, it chooses what information can enter working memory. There is growing evidence that sensory memory is collected through top-down processing to fill the gaps in from long-term memory. Similar to the description of long-term memory providing information to working memory. It seems like this is the critical role of attention. It is able to recruit information from long-term memory and then facilitate this task of determining which sensory information is needed for a current task. Interestingly, it has been observed that young children and older people do worse at filtering out irrelevant information to their task, showing that the brain can't do this perfectly. It also suggests that either critical functioning of some structure or mechanism is necessary to filtering out this information. Or it could also suggest that long-term memory plays a role in learning what information is important and which isn't. However, important sensory information not pertaining to current tasks also needs to enter attention. There is a strong correlation between working memory capacity and attentional control. Oberauer discusses this effect, looking at studies of when people are likely to shift their attention. When people paid attention to auditory stimuli, they were more likely to get distracted than normal. However, when paying attention to visual stimuli, they were less likely to get distracted by outside stimuli than normal. Furthermore, when a distracting stimulus is different from the type of stimulus that is currently in our focus of attention, we are less likely to get distracted. That is, when people pay attention to visual stimuli, they are less likely to get distracted by auditory stimuli, and vice versa. When people pay attention to auditory information, they are less likely to get distracted by visual stimuli. This supports the idea that the type of sensory attention has an effect on attentional control and its interaction with attention. Relating back to Baddeley's model of working memory and separating working memory into three different streams. If attention is viewed as a resource to bring information to working memory, some evidence suggests that attended to items do not necessarily get stored in working memory. This, however, does not correspond with the view that attention is a subset of working memory. In the experiment, When monkeys were asked to attend to items, and a few seconds later when they were surprisingly tested on those items, the monkeys could not remember them. While one explanation might be that information might not enter working memory, a different explanation might be that those items entered working memory and then were removed or lost. Opposing evidence suggests that there is still some sort of encoding for attended stimuli in working memory, even if participants only need to process some information and not remember it. Finally, an alternative finding also suggested that even when items were not attended to, they could also slip into working memory, leading to the conclusion that attention is not necessary for the encoding of information into memory. So how does memory get stored and maintained in working memory at the neuronal level? One of the major questions is what form does memory take on when it is attended to versus when it is not. Recent brain imaging evidence suggests that unattended memory items are held at activity silent states, while attended memory items are held in active states. Previous models with silent memory relied on fast synaptic plasticity to make changes in short-term plasticity, making it easier for neurons to fire. Others used Hebbian plasticity, which was proposed to facilitate sequencing for serial items. One limitation of these models is that they don't produce sustained activity, which is an important characteristic for working memory. Another model that applies to this is the attractor model, where feedback between neurons in a set keeps them activated so that they are held at a so-called attractor state. These models are able to represent sustained information, and they are able to model similar information interfering with each other, as is seen in behavioral data. However, they cannot regain the information after it leaves the active state, which seems to happen when unattended memory items are in the activity silent state. Thomas Christophel suggested a plastic attractor network, one that combines an active memory state with rapid Hebbian plasticity to allow activity silent states for unattended memory items. In the plastic attractor network, the green neurons encode sensory information and pass it onto the blue conjunctive neurons, which have rapid plasticity following the Hebbian associative rule. These conjunctive neurons are responsible for storing working memory. The green sensory neurons are representative of information in the sensory areas, and the blue conjunctive neurons represent neurons in the prefrontal cortex. In this example, in the first box, we can see the red neurons are neurons that are activated by sensory stimuli. In the second box, they project into the conjunctive blue neurons. These then compete with one another, establishing a stable pattern of activity in the third box, and forming connections through plasticity, which can be seen as solid lines in the third image. When input changes in the fourth image, a new stimulus activates a different set of neurons, and the active memory of the first image is lost. The fifth image reactivates part of the stimulus of the original encoding. This then reactivates the whole original encoding of the first stimulus, bringing back the original stimulus into working memory. While this model uses sensory information to encode working memory, long-term memory could also follow a similar pattern to encode working memory. One of the key features of this model compared to other models is its ability to bring back inactivated information, similar to what was seen in humans. Like experimental data, this model has a limited capacity for the number of items that can be held in working memory. As more information is added, previous synaptic weights can be corrupted, interfering with previous memories. This model is also able to replicate the serial order effect, that is, recalling the first and last objects in a sequence better than other objects. The reason that the first item can be memorized better is that previous activity doesn't interfere with this encoding, allowing stronger synapses to form. And the last item is most recent, so there are no other items that can interfere with its storage. The time it takes to memorize an item is also similar to empirical evidence of memory precision. It shows trends in memory precision similar to those when more units of memory are memorized. Similarly, with decaying information, when information was not attended to, the synaptic weights that stored the information decayed, showing a loss of information. Lastly, similar to empirical evidence, we can see that representations of neurons in the prefrontal cortex are constantly changing. This is due to the constant changing synaptic weights from the sensory neurons. Some downsides to this model is that it's small and cannot scale to represent the prefrontal cortex. There can't be an all-to-all connection between the prefrontal cortex neurons and future neurons, and it is yet to be shown that this model can be extended to more features. Secondly, the model does not account for the topography of conjunctive cells in the prefrontal cortex. There have also been studies identifying more than one focus of attention, which is not addressed by this model. Another feature that this model lacks is being able to shift attention internally. It depends on external stimuli and only responds to them. Similarly, the prefrontal cortex has many other functions like cognitive control or preventing distractors that the model does not incorporate. Lastly, as modeled earlier, attention does not necessarily need to be directed to a stimulus for it to be encoded in the network. This cannot be done in this model. In conclusion, while the model lacks many features, it provides insight on how working memory could be held in both active and inactive states. If we come back to the question of how working memory gets stored and maintained, things get more complicated. A recent study came out questioning whether unattended memory items are really stored in silent representations. It pointed out that earlier studies may not have detected activity in some parts of the brain, or the studies were carried out on a small number of subjects. Christophel found significant evidence that while activity in the early visual areas was present during attended memory items, there was almost none for unattended memory items. However, when looking at unattended memory items in the intraparietal areas, while there was less activity, activity was still detected for unattended memory items. And similar with the frontal eye fields. This indicates that unattended memory might not be held in activity silent states, rather it is active. While these models detect active encodings in the frontal eye fields and the intraparietal areas, this does not necessarily mean it is due to recurrent excitation network. It can be caused by other forms of activity retention. Christophel observed that the onset of activity representing unattended memory items happened up to 6 to 10 seconds after the cue in the frontal eye fields and interparietal areas, suggesting this might be another reason that earlier studies hadn't detected this signal. This study suggests that attended and unattended items can be stored in the parietal cortex in a low-resolution representation, compared to a high resolution in the sensory areas, which is where attention occurs. They propose that item prioritization might depend on what information is sought out from the sensory information and is activated in the sensory system, making attention a system of collecting relevant information for processing. In conclusion, working memory provides an important system for combining information from long-term memory with sensory memory, enabling us to filter out irrelevant information and keeping relevant information in high detail. We can see that attention plays an important role in selecting information that is important for working memory in our current task. When looking at memory, many of the terms are relatively fluid, like the interaction of attention, working memory, and long-term memory. This can cause various interpretations of their interactions amongst different works, leading to different conclusions. It seems that as we learn more about their interactions and how they work, it will be easier for us to define them in more concrete terms. There are still many questions left up to the discussion. Here are a few that I find more important. First off, can working memory be stored in activity silent states? Knowing how working memory is stored would allow us to much more accurately predict what is happening. Second, what role does attention play in processing information? Is the role of attention limited to just gathering more information about items, or is it involved in another way with processing tasks? And lastly, how do different sensory systems like the phonological loop, episodic buffer, and visuospatial sketchpad interact with each other in working memory? Answers to these questions could provide lots of insight into how attention and working memory interact. Thanks for listening. I hope you found some of the information interesting, and possibly this video helped clarify the role that attention plays in working memory.